Good day to you. When you grow up in the US, or Japan for that matter, it would be easy to assume that most media are advertising based. I mean, after all, everywhere you look in the United States, you've got advertising coming at you. In fact, some estimates put the average person as seeing 400 to 500 ads per day. 400 to 500 ads per day. I don't know what else you do that many times per day, but 400 to 500 times a day. Imagine the impact on our psychology, on our consciousness, on our consumer purchasing habits. These ads are coming at us from every direction that you can imagine: the traditional legacy media, television, radio, newspapers, and also through billboards and non traditional media, such as social media. So advertising is bombarding us every single day. Even people are advertising things all the time. You're wearing a Nike t-shirt, you're advertising. You're advertising it for free. Actually, I have a column on that, advertising your body and rounding some corners. And so it's easy to assume that that's how media are paid for. But actually, media are paid for differently across the world, and including here in the United States, there are alternate methods of financing media other than just advertising. The truth is, when you follow the money, you really are learning where the power centers are that control the content of the media. Not that regulation doesn't have anything to do with it, not that cultural characteristics doesn't have anything to do with it, not that philosophies doesn't have anything to do with it, all those subjects that we've studied so far, but advertising has a direct connection to content. And so in this chapter, in this reading, I should say, we're taking on how media are financed and looking across the world. And you're going to discover, I think, some interesting things about your country when you do the research and how media are financed. Let's take on the first one, advertising. It is a form of financing media that sneaks up on us because we assume that the media that we're watching is free. We like to get on the internet without having to put a coin in a coin holder. We like getting on the internet without having to give a credit card. We like getting on the internet without having to subscribe to every website we go to, even though we are in a sense paying for the internet through our cell phone and through whatever internet service provider that you have. But advertising kind of stays hidden in that sense. It's in the background. We think that we're getting things for free because advertising is paying for it. In actual fact, advertising adds 5% onto whatever you're purchasing on average because of the cost that's involved in advertising. A company like Nike will have an advertising budget. That cost is passed on to the consumer. So advertising has been adopted partially because we don't perceive it as somebody reaching into our pockets and taking from us in order for us to be able to get on the web or video game or whatever we're doing with media, but also because it's become a model across the world that seems to be easy to implement. And so across the world, you have a shift away from other forms of media, other forms of financing towards advertising. Advertising, though, is said to have a lot of ill effects, among them noise pollution. And by noise, I don't just mean what you hear through your ears, but driving around. If you drive on Route 80, the beauty of the mountain scenery is taken away from you to some extent because of all the billboards that you have to put up with. You go to a place like Sweden, which I've mentioned before, which does not allow any advertising around the coast, and then you start to really focus your eyes on what you have in front of you, and then you start to see the mountains and the beaches and things that are more natural. Now, that's up to you whether that's your taste or not, but one criticism of advertising is that it causes that. A greater criticism when it comes to media content, though, is it dumbs down the content. Because advertisers are always searching for the largest audience possible, and therefore media companies are searching for the largest audience possible. In fact, it's said that when media sell time, like if you sell 30 seconds to an advertiser, you're not really selling time. What you are selling is an audience. You are selling access to McDonald's or Geico or Verizon to an audience that you know is going to be predictable. It's an audience that you have measured by the Nielsen ratings. That audience is going to be, for example, 18 to 35-year-old females. And so you can guarantee that you can deliver that demographic to an advertiser. So you're really selling an audience when you're involved in advertising as a financing method. And advertisers are not going to want to see programming that causes bits and pieces of the audience to pull off. An audience that will leave the program or the newspaper article, the website, because the words are too intellectual, so they leave. Or because the subject matter is too racy. It's talking about subjects that maybe involve nudity or profanity or harsh politics. So advertising dumbs down the programming, and we have a term that we refer to when that happens. It's called lowest common denominator, or LCD content. The programming content comes down to suit as many people as possible. I can illustrate that by saying if I was to take this class, which is 10 students, and put a radio receiver in the room and walk out of the room and say, okay, you guys choose a radio station when I come back. I can guarantee when I come back in, it's not going to be a metal station. It's not going to be a classical music station. It's not going to be anything other than probably the top 40 radio station or the top hits radio station. It's not that people love that kind of music, it's that it is the least objectionable to the most amount of people, and that's how the content is dumbed down. Advertising also is an area that is regulated in the media. We've talked about that a little bit. We'll talk about it more when we get to content, particularly in countries that don't want advertising to take over the content in terms of minutage. We've already talked about that. But also in terms of advertising being aimed at vulnerable children. Sweden has very strict laws when it comes to advertising towards children, as we have discussed. So advertising is said also to create a consumer mentality and a mentality that is not appropriate for children. But the consumer mentality that exists is that you have to constantly be in the mode of buying something. That we not only buy things to be happy, that's referred to as retail therapy, where we go to the mall because we've just been broken up with by our loved one, or because we've had a bad day and we're going to buy something that's nice. It's not just that advertising works its way into our consciousness in terms of retail therapy, it also affects our human relations. Like when you go to a restaurant, you're paying the waiter or waitress to be nice to you by that waiter or waitress expecting a tip. And that's a kind of human behavior that is crafted because money is in the picture. And the same goes for advertising as well. Many people perceive of the way that they have to conduct themselves in life as kind of promoting themselves, talking about themselves very often. In America, most people lead conversations with the word I. And sometimes you have conversations where two people are talking and one person just saying, oh, I have to go to work today and I still have a lot to do. And the other person responds by not by saying, oh, that must be difficult. How are you going to manage it? They respond by, oh, I have the same thing. I have to go to work too. There's a lot of I's that go on in American conversation. We can say that advertising has something to do with it. So advertising has its positives, but it also has its negatives, which are not necessarily on the forefront of our minds. So that wraps up advertising. Now let's go into another way of financing media. I don't know if you'll find this in your country. It's called the license fee. The license fee is an idea. Excuse me one sec. Hey, Maccabee, can I call you right back? All right, thanks. All right, so the license fee in other countries is a mechanism by which public media are financed. And the governments in those countries basically say, we need to have a strong selection of public service media that are in our overall selection of content. That we can't just leave it up to advertisers because they're wanting to sell things all the time. They're not going to be producing programming that's going to elevate our interests. So we need to have a strong public service media sector. And in fact, if you pick up a remote control in Britain for your TV, or in France, or almost any European country, and you start clicking through the channels, 1 out of every 2 is going to be a public service channel, at least in the first 20 channels. In Britain alone, you've got 3 BBC channels that you can come across. And these channels are not running advertising at all because they are using funding from the license fee, which you pay a license fee, and that money is used to allocate by the government, is allocated towards entities, usually independent entities that then fund public service media. The license fee in Britain is about $400, and you pay it when you buy a TV set. That's how you're tracked. You purchase a television, your name goes into a database, and then you have to pay that fee, otherwise you're subjected to being fined by the government. It's not a tax, it's a license fee, just like you pay a dog license fee, or you pay a license fee for your car. That's the idea. It's the idea that media need to be funded by a non-partisan, non-self-interested entity so that the content is not always about trying to drive you to purchase something. The content can be a documentary. And when I say documentary, I don't necessarily mean a really stuffy educational documentary. Britain is in the UK is full of documentaries tracking real people. I saw a documentary that was fascinating. It followed 2 young people like yourselves maybe who went through college and started to accumulate a bunch of debt because of the student loans that they needed to take out to pay their tuition. And this documentary tracked them through their junior year, their senior year, and then 2 years into the workplace. So it took 4 years to make. That is not a viable business model for an advertising-based television show. But in a license fee funded television content producing entity, you can spend 4 years to do it and do it right, to have a longitudinal look at the impact of debt on students. And so the license fee is a mechanism that is used by countries that have a philosophy, to return to that, a social responsibility philosophy, to provide media that have not so much an interest in making money, but an interest in serving people, just like utilities run into your house, just like electricity is a service to you, it's a public service to you. That's what we're talking about here with a license fee. Next up as a method of financing is government appropriation. Government appropriation is where the government says, okay, we are going to just flat out allocate money to a media producing entity. And that money may come, like it does in Mexico, from oil that's sold. Mexico is an oil-rich country, and the oil profits that come out of Mexico, some of which are dedicated to media production. Or in Canada, which just is taken care of, the government appropriation is just taken care of by basic taxation. Canada is in general is a higher tax country than has higher taxation than the United States. It differs by the province in Canada, but part of the reason for that is so that public service media are funded. And so you have the CBC in Canada, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. But here in the US, we do have some government appropriation. It's called National Public Radio, and it's also called the Public Broadcasting System, or PBS, which is the TV side, which gave you Sesame Street when you were a kid. And those monies are collected by the government. They come from our taxes, and they're given to an entity called the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the CPB. And then the PBS and NPR can apply for block grants, and that's how they fund their programming. But compared to other countries, it's a very tiny portion. NPR and PBS are vastly underfunded. And even right now, there's discussion about eliminating them altogether. So the idea is here in the country, but not to the extent that it's in Europe and in other places. Of course, with government appropriation, you have the problem of government having the opportunity to control or influence the content. And so that is a downside to government appropriation. Next up is the idea of user fees. User fees are also very popular. It's where you pay per use for the media content that you're accessing. It can be paid by prescription, or it can be paid per issue, like when you buy a magazine at a convenience store. It's the idea that you're paying only for what you're using. And there has been discussion of that here in the US with cable television, for example. Why should you have to buy a package when you're only watching, on average, maybe 3 television channels? I mean, I can go home, I can watch 120 television channels because of my cable programming, but I'm usually only watching 2 or 3. So why should I pay for the rest? Well, that's under discussion. It's the idea of a user fee, that you pay for it. And then that finally takes us to donation. Donation is where media properties, usually public media, ask for money. You can see that with Wikipedia once a year. Wikipedia is an advertising-free based web service. And many people, including professors, put it down. They say that students use it too much in class, but I'm very big on Wikipedia as a starting point. It has a thorough vetting process by experts for information that's posted there, and it's advertising free. Instead, what they do is they ask for donations once a year. So does the Guardian newspaper. If some of your research is taking you to the Guardian newspaper, which is really more of an international news organization now than it was a newspaper. I remember when it was just a newspaper in Britain, I used to read that almost every single morning, the Guardian. It's an excellent newspaper. They are also asking for donations once a year so that they don't have to base a lot of their content on advertising-supported monies. So donation is something that you ask the public for, but it can turn into begging. Like if you are looking at any NPR or looking at any PBS program in April, when people are getting ready to file their taxes and they're looking for tax deductions, you have people on the air begging. That's the way it appears to me, begging for money, and you get this free coffee mug if you donate. Donations also will rise and fall with the economy. When people don't have discretionary income, they're not going to donate, so it's not a reliable source of income like the license fee is. So those are the basic ways that media properties can be financed, and the implications that those basic ways have for content are something that we're seeking to discover as we continue on in this class. And this is what you'll be focusing on today in your country media research. You're going to see what kinds of those what kinds of those financing methods are being used in the country that you're studying in terms of the spectrum of media: print, broadcast, and web media. Good luck with it. I look forward to reading your post. Have a great day.